Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Brian Fishman. I'm a counterterrorism fellow here at New America. I'm very pleased to have our speakers with us today. Jere Van Dyk, whose book we're all here to hear about, has been a reporter for a long time, including spending quite a while in Afghanistan and South Asia in the 70s and the early 80s. A time that he wrote a book called In Afghanistan about. He spent time with Jalaluddin Haqqani, who is still quite famous, as many of you know, in eastern Afghanistan. And most recently, in 2008, when he was kidnapped and held by a Taliban faction for 45 days in somewhere in the northern Fatah, and we're still not quite sure exactly where. With him is Anand Gopal, who is a reporter. He's done a lot of work for the Christian Science Monitor, New York Times, has spent the last 3 years essentially reporting from Afghanistan, speaks Dari fluently and pretty passable Pashto. So he's also done some work here for New America, writing about North Waziristan. We co-authored a piece, but he did all the hard work, and I just got to put my name on it, on North Waziristan, and he's done some very fascinating interviews, including being able to communicate with Siraj Haqqani and Mullah Barater shortly before he was arrested in Pakistan, and he will be commenting on Jere's comments. So with that, I will get out of the way, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Brian. It's very nice to be here among, I am sure, a great number of experts. Perhaps many of you know a lot more about Afghanistan and Pakistan than I do. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about my experiences over the years and why I was living and traveling along the border and why I think I was kidnapped. Yesterday, I was doing an interview on Al Jazeera English in the afternoon. And I was in New York, and the moderator was in Washington. And they had Abdul Salim Zaif, who some of you may know as a former intimate of Mullah Omar, as well as the former Taliban Afghan ambassador to Pakistan, who became somewhat famous after 9/11 because we saw him on television all the time. And we had a standard political discussion going back and forth, he in Kabul, to the moderator, and then to me. And then Raz Khan, the moderator, asked a very interesting question, which I thought was wonderful. He said, in effect, what is the difference between being in prison by the Taliban or by the Americans? And for me, and I also think for Zaif, whom I met and talked with briefly in very early 2007, perhaps late 2006, it became emotional. It became emotional for me, and I had to sit there and listen because he became increasingly angry. And he wouldn't let the moderator talk. And all of a sudden, what became a political discussion became a very deeply personal discussion. And I saw all the anger and all the bitterness in him and the residue of what happened to him. And so I understand that residue. And it's most important to try and deal with that, go forward, which is why after 2 years I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today. And it's really quite remarkable when I think about it that the conversation I was having yesterday, that how in 1973, when I was a very young man, just finished school in Paris, sitting in a cafe with a number of friends of mine, and like all young men, many young men, deciding what we wanted to do in the future. This man wanted to be a lawyer. This man wanted to work for the World Bank. This man wanted to work for Sotheby's, the art auction house. This man wanted to be a journalist. And I said, I want to go to Afghanistan. It was romance. It was adventure. It was excitement. A few months later, I convinced my parents, to this day, I don't know why they said yes, to let my younger brother join me, a teenager, drop out of school. And together we bought an old Volkswagen in Frankfurt, near where I'd been in the Army. And we drove across Asia together. We ran out of money. Lived on the top. We couldn't afford a hotel. Lived on top of a hotel in Kabul. At that time, Kabul was, according to some of the guidebooks, Paris of the East. Schoolgirls wore short skirts and long socks and laughed in the streets. My brother told me there was a discotheque. There were outdoor cafes, restaurants, cinemas, Russian movies. In the afternoon, long camel caravans came slowly through the streets. At night, you could hear the Rolling Stones mixed with the evening call to prayer. It was romantic, it was wonderful. But earlier that year, the brother-in-law and the first cousin of the king, Zahir Shah, a man named Daud Khan, overthrew his brother-in-law and first cousin and established a kingdom. Secretly, a group of men, some associated with the Islamic faculty in Kabul, one of whom was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, began to meet and figure what they could do to overthrow the government. Just a couple of years ago, I found the notes of that meeting. There's a compound in Kabul today that has everything from that period. Shortly thereafter, they fled across the border to Peshawar, where they were taken in by the Pakistani government. They were trained by the Pakistani military. A couple of years ago, I asked former President Rabbani, is it true that they brought you over to be the leader? And he said, yes. We would have worked with Daoud, but he was a communist, and we couldn't do that. So we did confirm that the Mujahideen, they later were called, began, according to him, in 1973. I came back, and I moved to Washington, D.C., and I worked in the Senate for Senator Jackson, a senator from Washington State. I grew up in a small town in that state. We were concerned here with the Arab oil embargo containing communism. Pakistan was one of America's principal allies in the attempt to surround the Soviet Union and contain communism. July of 1975, the Mujahideen, as they were now called, attacked for the first time in Afghanistan. Ahmad Shah Massoud led the attack in Panjshir. Other attacks were down near Jalalabad. In 1979, at home in Washington State, watching the news on television, I saw the Soviet tanks roll into Kabul, and I said, I have to return. Made an arrangement with the New York Times, went back to Peshawar, and this time, this small group of men who had fled now were head of political parties, Rabbani, Hekmatyar, and others. I preferred a man named Yunus Khalis. He introduced me to other men in his group, a man named now called Hajiddin Muhammad in particular. And then we drove down through the tribal areas to Miram Shah. What I forgot to mention was, in 1973, two other things. When I was there, I had a visa problem, such as it was then, and I had to drive my car, an old beat-up Volkswagen, from Kabul to Peshawar. It's like going on a Sunday drive. I also spent the afternoon with a Kuchi nomad caravan, and they invited me into their tent, their home. I looked around, and I saw they had nothing. But they gave me the sugar and the tea that they had. It was my first introduction to what I later came to know Pashtun-Wali. Pashtun, the principal ethnic group in Afghanistan, across the border in Pakistan, Wali, way of Ism, the way of the Pashtuns. 1981, I hiked with guides up into Paktia province to a place called Shahikot, where I lived with Haqqani and his men. First day I got there, he gave me a plate of honey, welcomed me. For the next month when we were together, when we would go out on attacks, they always did everything they could to protect me. Protect to the death, the guest in your home, part of Pashtun-Wali. Other part I saw was the role of Islam. I watched these men bow put their heads in the dirt, rifles in front of them, and the strength that they got from that. Before we went out to attack, Haqqani would stand up and put a Quran in the air, and men would walk under it. It gave them their strength. It's fascinating. I grew up in a deeply religious, fundamentalist family in Washington State. Today we would call fundamentalists. We were apolitical. And I saw the similarities between what we used to say was God willing and what they said was inshallah. So I was drawn to this. I came back to New York, wrote my articles for the Times, wrote a book. And then the op-ed page editor at the Times asked me to write a piece. And I did. I passed on the plea that the Afghans had asked me constantly about. We need something with which to shoot down the helicopters in Afghanistan. So I wrote this plea, knowing full well that the more we did, the more the Soviets would do, and the more destruction would come. After that, a man named Zalmay Khalilzad, then a young assistant professor at Columbia, came to me and asked me if I would be the director of an organization called Friends of Afghanistan. And I later found out it was run by, I did it because I felt guilty for what I had written, and I wanted to help the women and children. I later found out it was run by the National Security Council and the State Department, and many years later, when I worked as a contract writer for National Geographic, and my editor, a prominent novelist named Charles McCary, former CIA, said, sounds like something we would have started. At that time, then the United States and Pakistan brought what was now called the Mujahideen government of Afghanistan in exile to New York to establish their credentials against the then communist government in the United Nations, and to meet with President Reagan. And the president was Hekmatyar. So Gulbuddin and I spent hours and hours and hours together. Shortly thereafter, when they returned, I got a call from the Committee to Protect Journalists. Hekmatyar has put your name on a death list. Do you want to write an op-ed piece about that? I said no. First and only time in my life I ever turned down a writing assignment. I'd had enough of the politics. I couldn't go back to Afghanistan. Then in 1996, I traveled the world for National Geographic to far, far away places. Exploration work, trying to forget Afghanistan. Never could. 1996, I see where a man named Osama bin Laden returns to Afghanistan. He lands where? He lands in Jalalabad. Years later, I hear that Rabbani, then the president, gives him permission to land. He goes up and he stays with Yunus Khalis. Yunus Khalis was the man I stayed with. 2002, I'm back in Afghanistan working now as a freelance radio reporter for CBS News, standing south of Gardez, watching the B-52s bomb a place called Shahi Kot, what the Americans called the largest ground offensive since Vietnam. Wait a minute, I lived at Shahi Kot with Haqqani. There's something very poignant about that to me. I went down to see Yunus Khalis again in 2002 because I began to hear stories about how his sons took bin Laden from Tora Bora down to the tribal areas. I wanted to find out just how close he was to bin Laden, and of course, to go further from that. I saw him again in 2003. Too many people around. They didn't trust me. I was never allowed to my language wasn't good enough, of course, but I had an interpreter with me. Still wouldn't let me talk to him. Increasingly, I became more and more determined to find out what was really going on, if there's only a way I could get to Haqqani. 2006, became the technical advisor on this movie, Charlie Wilson's War. Terrible disputes with the CIA advisor. I think the director, Mike Nichols, may have wanted that for the so-called creative tension that it engendered. But it upset me. I have to find things. I went back to Afghanistan and went up along the border to where Pat Tillman was killed. It was the first time south of the coast, up in the mountains. We were about 2 miles from the border. One of my guards said, I'm having trouble with Haqqani. I said, what do you mean, what kind of trouble? Oh, we're involved in a land dispute over timber and firewood. I said, Haqqani's doing business here? He said, he does business on both sides of the border. I said, how far away are we? Oh, just over there. It's a couple kilometers. How am I going to do this? I got to cross over. Came back. I was writing something for Army War College on Islamic fundamentalism in Asia. Came back. Arranged for a contract with Henry Holt, Times Books, to go back and explore the borderlands. Just how close can I come to the tribal areas? Can I do this? August 2007, I went back, grew my hair long, let my beard grow, began to fast, and began to go and try and find men who were part of the Haqqani network, part of the Yunus Khalis network, who in my limited experience and limited knowledge, I felt were divided into two types. Those who are prominently a part of the Afghan government today, and those who have gone up into the mountains. Also, Hekmatyar's group, although I was scared to death of Hekmatyar because of the death threat. But going through members of parliament, I started to work my way in back to where it was before. I took my book that I'd written many years before. The text didn't mean anything. The pictures meant everything. I was here with you before, when your backs were against the wall. I'm not like these other journalists. Help me. It was my calling card. Finally, I met a man, today a member of parliament, former Mujahideen commander under Yunus Khalis, said, I know a man. I know a Taliban leader in the tribal areas. The problem is, he assassinated Haji Qadir a vice president of Afghanistan. Haji Qadir happened to be the brother of Din Mohammed, my closest and oldest friend in Afghanistan. How could I do this? Could I betray my oldest friend, or the man I felt closest to in Afghanistan, to do this? I wrestled with this. Using another interpreter, I crossed, finally, first time in September, Oman agency with very religious drug traffickers, and went in for a day. We came back out. Oh, we did it. We made it. We passed the border post. No one knew I was Afghan. By then, I knew how to dress, how to act, how to look at a man in a way I felt, how to wash my hands, how to dress, not quite how to pray. But I was walking a very fine line, trying constantly to penetrate Pashtun culture and not be discovered. I never registered at the embassy. I never told any military or an organization, clearly no intelligence agency that I knew of, what I was doing. I moved further and further away from journalists. Spent more and more time in Afghan restaurants, and more time with Afghans. Finally, my interpreter, the first one, was very close friends with a man named Ajmal Naqshbandi, who was beheaded in April when he was kidnapped with an Italian journalist down in Helmand, refused to cross again. I had to find somebody. I could not find an interpreter along the border or all of Afghanistan who was willing to cross with me. Finally, using an old contact I had before, I went to the former minister of education, and through him, his nephew came to me and he said, "I'll do it. I'll go with you. We can do all these things." Pretty cavalier about this. And then he was quiet and he said, "We have to make an agreement that my neck is your neck, that if I die, you will take care of my children." I said, he does understand. So we went with the Taliban 4 different times. Each time, scared to death. Each time, they kept their word. They did not harm me. I met with them twice in Kunar province, once in Chitral, once in Nangarhar, about 6 hours south of, they said, we didn't go this way, but 6 hours hike south of Tora Bora. I'm not sure exactly where we were. They allowed me to take photographs. I was with them for a few hours. We got out, but it wasn't enough. Finally, and this took months to arrange, the main Taliban commander, the man who was responsible or involved in the assassination of Haji Qadir, which the more I thought about it made me think that how could one Taliban commander launch an attack that's going to kill a vice president of Afghanistan? And as people said to me, he couldn't have done that alone. He had institutional backing. I began to think, I'm really over my head. February 12th. Pardon? February 12th, 2008. So I started in August 2007, and that's when I began to grow my hair long and the beard and began to live along the border and going with the Taliban from August until February. Finally, it was set up. We're going to go deep for 1 month to live with the Taliban. Go up to Bajur or to Swat, down to Waziristan. I had to write 2 letters, one to Haqqani and one to Hekmatyar. And I sat there, do I really want to see Hekmatyar? Do I really want to attempt this? Do I really have a chance to do all of this? Sirajuddin Haqqani, of course, is the famous person today. Gentleman on my right, had conversations with him. One of the most powerful Taliban leaders. I had no interest in seeing him. I wanted to see his father. Because I felt the father. I didn't believe that the father had stepped aside and the son was doing things on his own. I began to hear many things about him along the border. This man, Haqqani, who, another thing about him forgot to say that's very important. One week in 1981 when we were together, an Egyptian army major came to stay with us. He was so happy that Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, had been assassinated. Years later, I realized, or in my mind, I said, this was the very beginning, very possibly, of Al-Qaeda. Then with Osama bin Laden coming back and staying near Khalas, I began to wonder more and more about this, and the more and more stories I heard. And then along the border, a man pointed out the small baked mud mosque that Haqqani, a Malang, a mullah who stands by the road and puts out his hand and begs for money to build his little mosque. This is where he started. They called him a scrap dealer. That after the Soviets left, he made his money hustling old beat-up scrap or things left over from the war. They despised him, every tribal chief along the border. Who is this nothing? This low man on the tribal totem pole. You go to Kos today, and this magnificent mosque dominates the skyline, like a cathedral dominates the skyline of a Catholic church in France or Spain. How did he do this? No, not just because he's married to a woman from the United Arab Republic, or where exactly she's from, I'm not sure. He has an Arab wife. I have to find this. So I wrote the letter to him. It was passed on through various sources to Abdullah, the man who was going to take me deep into the tribal areas. So on February 12th, he was set, 2008. Time to come down. I had gone up to Kabul for a while, back along the border, checked in a guest house. I got a call from the next night, from my today member of parliament, the man I trusted, the man who said, Haji Qadir is dead, but the man who killed him, my friend, wants to come back to Afghanistan. He needs me. Plus, he's Pashtun. Yes, he'll take care of me. They protected me throughout the 1980s. The Taliban I was with 4 times didn't kill me. I'll be okay. Well, it just so happens that at that same time, the Pakistani ambassador to Afghanistan was kidnapped. Everybody along the border said it's all a drama. It doesn't mean anything. It's all the work of the ISI. My man in Kabul called and said, first time he ever called me, don't cross the border. It's too dangerous for you. But everybody here is saying it's okay. It's too dangerous for you. What am I going to do? I decided to go up and see. Okay, I won't go. Trust your instincts. I told my interpreter, call Haji Din Mohammed, now the governor of Kabul. Tell him I want to come back. I want to try another plan. Haji Din Mohammed's son's driver comes to the room at the same time that Abdullah's guard comes to the room, crosses the border to take us across the border into Afghanistan, or to Pakistan. I have to make a decision within 15 seconds. These 2 men, arch enemies, in 2 separate clans, if you will, arch enemies. Who am I going to go with? I made the fateful decision. Okay, we leave. February 16th, we drove to the border. My driver, who had taken me through Taliban country to meet the Taliban at different times, we got on as we stopped in the foothills, came over with watery eyes, and he hugged me, and he gave me a kiss. No Afghan has ever kissed me in the 30 years that I've been associated with Afghanistan. I said, what I'm about to do is very dangerous. We hiked for about 7 hours into the mountains, going north, sundown, walking through a small valley, my 2 bodyguards in the lead, me, my interpreter, falling further and further behind. I look up. I see a black tinge moving. It's not a sheep. It's not a goat. I knew immediately what it was. The Taliban. The man jumped up, rocket-propelled grenade launcher in his hand, shouting, Kenna, Kenna, get down, get down. I'm running down the mountain, 12 of them. Next thing I knew, he was 2 feet away from me, 3 feet away from me, holding that weapon in my eyes, his eyes dark and gleamy. I said, I'm dead. I'm dead. They took me up onto a ridge, faced me west. I was still in shock, so my back was straight then. Stood there waiting for what I knew was coming. Then slowly, the black turban was wrapped around me, and I was blindfolded, and I became helpless and weak and afraid, but waited for the knife or for the gun, for the rifle. Obviously, it didn't happen. Took me up, went deeper into the mountains. And that night, finally, when it was cold, higher up, entered a small room, put me on a cot, untied the blindfold, and I was happy. I wasn't alone. My 2 bodyguards and my interpreter were with me. They had separated us. We had driven for 2 hours or so to get there. Who is your father? What is your father's name? That's the first question you ask. Well, they asked my name and my father's name. I said to myself, in my limited understanding of this culture, how remarkable, how deep I am in Pashtun culture, that the most important question is, and many people will feel, and I do feel, one of the most important questions you can always ask in Afghanistan, who's your grandfather? The importance of tribal lineage. Later, Taliban went in the next room to eat. Two men who I later learned would be, of course, my jailers. So my two bodyguards are sitting on a cot. They say, if they start to torture us or start to kill us, we have to kill them. So the one bodyguard says, I'll take him. The other one says, I'll take him. I go, my life has just changed again. Not only am I up here in the middle of somewhere in the tribal areas of Pakistan in a Taliban prison, but I now have to kill or be killed. Where's the safety on the Kalashnikov? How do I do this? Already I looked at the chains on the floor. I looked for blood on the walls. We were in this room for 45 days. I couldn't see more than 6 feet away. It was dark. We were allowed out 3 minutes at night. There were my two bodyguards, my interpreter, the two jailers, and the Taliban commander. And allegiances shifted. Began to distrust one another. We argued with one another. We had turf battles over which bed we should be on. My interpreter drew further and further into himself, refused to interpret for me. I realized that increasingly I was alone. I couldn't trust anybody. So one night we had an interrogation. So I'm going to read just a little bit of this interrogation. There were about 15 Taliban in the room holding flashlights, lanterns, staring at me. The Taliban commander is on the floor. We're both sitting about 3 feet from one another. His eyes are gleaming like a cat's eyes. I said, I have to talk to this man. I have to save my own life. How am I going to do this? And so we had this talk for close to 2, maybe 2.5, I don't know how long, hours. Probably now about 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock at night. We want to use you to exchange you for prisoners from Cuba or Bagram, he said. I felt cold. I felt a pit in my stomach. My hope disappeared. The United States did not negotiate with terrorists. I had to tell him. I'm not important, I said. I'm only one small, insignificant man. America doesn't care about me. I'm only important to myself. You are important for us, said the Malavi. You are small to America. You are important to us for release of our comrades in prison. I would be here for months, and then they would kill me. I had to stop this. The United States will not negotiate, I said. I was taking a chance. I was pushing it. I had no choice. I didn't dare call them terrorists. They were a brotherhood fighting to kill the invader, as their ancestors had fought countless invaders. They were young men anxious to create a more equal and perfect world. That is America's policy, I said. It will never exchange prisoners for me. I'm important to you, but not to America. I don't work for the government. I am by myself. I'm dead, I said. I'm dead. The Malavi motioned to one of his men. He placed 2 plastic sacks in front of him. He opened one and took out 3 toothbrushes, 2 bars of soap, a bottle of shampoo, toilet paper, petroleum jelly, and 2 towels, and put them in front of us. Thank you, I said. Thank you very much. You're not going to kill us. There were 2 sides. There was what I saw as the Pashtunwali side. You're a guest in our home. We will protect you to the death. My jailer constantly said, I will protect you. I will die before you do. At the same time, he said, you either convert or you die. So growing up in this very religious family that I grew up in, I understood. I had a psychological understanding. I do have a psychological understanding, I feel, of fundamentalism. But I was captured by Wahhabis. They made it very clear that they were Wahhabis and that they had the true faith. They knew more than the Deobandi. They knew more than other Muslims how one should live, how high one's pants should be, where one should put one's hands on the chest, how close or closer one could be to God. My prayers didn't count because I was not a Muslim. But if I tried and drew close to God, perhaps I would convert and then I would be saved. They would find me a wife and I could join them. We listened to Taliban recruiting tapes. They talked about taking my kidneys. They talked about my family. They had done negotiations. They knew where my family was. At the same time, we will never kill you. We will protect you. It was a roller coaster. A predator appeared overhead. Is that there because the United States is looking for me? Does someone know I'm here? Or is it because all the Taliban who keep coming and going, passing by that dark window out of which I could barely see, on their way to Afghanistan and back? Or is that predator there watching them? And is that American predator going to kill us? On it went. Darker and darker it became. It's never going to end. What am I going to do? Finally, I had to speak into my own recorder and tell them my name, where I was, and the Taliban hadn't harmed me. And I realized we were sending a message to the outside that they would know. Then there was a mock execution when the men stood behind me. And I felt the rifle on my temple. And they took my hat off. And the men with the sunglasses and the rifles moved closer. And the Malavi took my camera. And he said, "How does this work?" And I said, "You're going to film my own execution. And I'm going to help you by turning on the camera." And the man went like this to pull it in, to take out the knife. And I thought of Nicholas Berg and Daniel Pearl. And it was almost, now that I think about it 2 years later, almost 6 years to the day that Daniel Pearl was killed in Karachi. And I was the next American kidnapped after him. Finally, the Malavi came one day and said, "I've made the decision to release you. Congratulations on escaping death. You're going to be with your wife tonight." I'm not married. I wouldn't do this if I were married. My wife? Is it my sister? Did she get involved? Did she bring the $1 million that they want? Or was it the woman who was subletting my apartment in New York, an old girlfriend from years past? Did they contact her? How? What? Congratulations, you're going to be with your wife tonight. We were passed from one Taliban group to the next, crossed rivers, flashlights, going this group, that group. Finally, we made our way back to just across by the border. And then a man named Abdullah appeared. And he said, "I talked to Sirajuddin, I talked to Batullah Masood, but they said no. If I bring you two here, to them, or if I take you to Waziristan, we'll all die. Your people have been after me. Others have been after me. I apologize that you were kidnapped. I couldn't do anything about it. But if you want to go to Waziristan now, I'll take you." The trouble is, I thought, we can still go. But I was too beat up by then. We made our way back across, they took my interpreter and me back across the final river, from one truck to the next, and a man came up with a flashlight. He showed me a card. And it was the name of the CBS manager in Afghanistan. And I almost broke down. He took me to the U.S. military base, where the CIA, I assume it was the CIA, said, "We know all about you." Where the FBI said, "You broke the law and crossed the border." But then they took me, and they took care of me. In 1981, I was a very young, naive, fledgling journalist. I made my way to Pakistan. Mike Kaufman, the New York Times correspondent for South Asia, took me up into the mountains. And we looked across west towards Afghanistan. And he said, "Don't worry about the story. It will come to you." My goal was to penetrate the tribal areas. Yes, there was a certain amount of hubris in this. I want to be the first. I'm going to do this. I can do what no one else can do. I have these contacts. And I wanted to find out really where Osama bin Laden is. Can I be so crazy as to find out? Well, maybe Haqqani knows. His tie to call us all of this. Maybe I can get to Hekmatyar. Maybe I can do all these things. But most of all, I want to find out what the Taliban are really like. It's just as I once learned what the Mujahideen are like. Well, I didn't do all those things, but I did find out what the Taliban are like. And the story did come to me. Deep down, ultimately, what this book is about is not just a story of how I found out about the Taliban, but how in that time in prison, the Taliban enabled me to find out the deepest core what I am myself. And that's the story. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Sorry. I want to talk a little bit about the context or the background with some of the things that Jere said. Particularly, he mentioned Haqqani a lot, and I don't know how much people know about who he is or his network or what they represent, but I thought I would mention or talk about that a little bit just so we can understand a little bit more about Jere's experiences and what they mean. And I traveled to the southeast quite a bit and have met and interviewed a number of the Haqqani fighters, including Sirajuddin. And what's striking in the times that I've met them is how different they are from the Taliban, from the rest of the Taliban, how they really are sort of a strain on of their own. Just to give you a couple of examples to get you to understand the differences. The majority of the Haqqani fighters are full-time madrasa students living in Pakistan who tend to come over across the border into Afghanistan and launch attacks, which is pretty different from the rest of the Taliban, who typically are farmers and who fight in the areas in which they live. They're rooted in the villages in which they operate. Another big difference between the two is the existence of all sorts of foreign fighters, and it's when you're talking about the Haqqanis, it's sort of like a United Nations of foreign militants. There's Uzbeks, Chechens, Germans, Arabs, and it goes on. And there's foreign fighters in the rest of the Taliban as well. But what's interesting about this is the foreign fighters of the Haqqani network tend to sort of be completely integrated into the Haqqani structure. So if you ever watch the news and hear about a big suicide attack in Kabul, typically those are done by the Haqqani group, and typically those involve foreign fighters fighting alongside of Afghan fighters and Pakistani fighters. And Sirajuddin himself, he's quite remarkable because he's only 31 or 32 years old. He's far younger than anybody else who's of that level of leadership in the Taliban. And he's from a different generation of Taliban. He's not like many of the people that Jere must have met in the early 80s who are part of the anti-Soviet insurgency, mujahideen fighters, perhaps born in the 60s or 70s or even 80s and fought in the 90s. Siraj wasn't part of that generation, and he grew up in a completely different sort of environment from the people who were fighting in the 80s. He grew up alongside of all sorts of jihadists, Arab jihadists. He grew up near training camps, and it was a completely different sort of world that he was born into and raised in. And he carries that radicalized worldview today. It's present in everything that group does. And I think a lot of it comes from his background there. And it's sort of the coalescence of these factors, of his background, of the fact that the fighters tend to be full-time religious students steeped in a sort of extreme interpretation of Islam, living in the Pakistani border regions, and the fact that they mingle very closely with foreign fighters, that makes them really one of the most potent forces that are in Afghanistan today. And they, again, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that the next time there's a major attack in Kabul that you hear about, that these are the guys that will be behind this sort of thing. So I think the real question, or what's interesting, is how they came to be this sort of force, particularly in the last few years. And because they're a very different group than perhaps what Jere saw in the early 80s, where they would even welcome somebody like him into their ranks. I mean, today, when I've gone and met the Haqqanis, it's usually with great difficulty, and I don't trust them enough to actually go and spend 5 or 6 or 7 days or anything with them, because you can obviously see the results of that. But just to really quickly go over where they came from or how they were able to become this potent force in the last few years. Jalaluddin, who was the patriarch of the Haqqani family, he had a government position with the Taliban. After 2001, when most of the Taliban fighters fled into Pakistan and most of the government officials fled, he and his family went along with them. They went to North Waziristan and kind of stayed out of things for a couple of years. In fact, they even sent some emissaries to the Afghan government to see if there's any way to reconcile with them. And I suspect this has something to do with the Haqqanis having a lot of business interest in the southeast area, wanting to basically live there, have their business interests and be left alone. But the emissary was rebuffed a number of times by the Afghan government, partly because the insurgency wasn't that potent at that time, and the Haqqanis really weren't an organized force. So the emissary goes back to Pakistan. They're living there, and they realize they don't have a place in the post-2001 society, and they decide to raise arms against the government. First thing they do is they call upon their old comrades who fought with them in the 80s against the Soviets, invite them to come back to Pakistan and to organize with them. Many of these people were people who felt like they didn't have a place in the post-2001 society as well. Just to give an example, there's a very powerful warlord who lives in the southeast. His name is Bachahan Zadran. And he was somebody who had a feud with Haqqani going back to the 70s and 80s. And once he came to power, I believe he was the governor right after 2001, he used his position to continue that feud. And so many of Haqqani's old fighters felt very disillusioned. And then when Haqqani came calling, they were very willing and ready to go across the border. And so they went to Pakistan, started organizing. But at this point, in 2003 or 4, Jalaluddin was getting on in years, and his young, charismatic, and more radical son was taking the reins, Sirajuddin. And so these people were gathering around Sirajuddin by 2004 and 2005. And Siraj was able to use his father's networks, his father's friends, particularly his father had, as Jerry mentioned briefly, that his father always had connections with the Arab militants, and so Siraj was able to tap into those networks and do fundraising in the Gulf states, for example. He was able to take over the family businesses, for example, timber smuggling, which is very prevalent. And by doing all of these things, he was able to develop an autonomous network of fighters that were separate from the rest of the Taliban, because they had their own source of manpower, which was the old Haqqani fighters from the 80s and 90s. They had their own source of funding. They also enjoyed very close relations with the Pakistani intelligence agencies. And the combination of those factors led the Haqqani group to emerge as a very powerful independent force, which it is today, and some would say it's the most powerful force in Afghanistan. Alongside the Haqqanis, there's, in the areas where Jerry was, there's a number of different militant groups. And I asked him before the talk, who exactly kidnapped you? And he said he didn't know. And that may seem surprising, but it actually makes a lot of sense to me, because there are so many different groups along the border, so many different shifting allegiances. It's very hard to parse out exactly who's who, who's acting in whose interest, which group is doing what. So alongside the Haqqanis, which are based out of North Waziristan, there are dozens of other groups. Some of them spend most of their time fighting against Pakistan, putting bombs in Pakistani cities. Others spend most of their time fighting against the Americans and the Afghans in Afghanistan. Some of them fight each other, some of them fight all three. And it's an extraordinarily complicated, confusing situation. But a figure like Sirajuddin Haqqani is at the forefront of all of this. He's possibly the most, I would say, most prominent member of this sort of militant nexus that exists in the border areas, and all of these groups together there's groups have kidnapped a number of journalists. A good friend of mine was kidnapped by a group up in across the border from Chitral, which is up in the northern part near Nuristan or in Kunar in Afghanistan. This is a group that is sort of a local group, not really known to have connections with other forces, but once they had him, and he was an American, once they had him, they realized that the most useful thing they can do is try to sell him up the chain to other insurgent groups. So they passed him along. He was passed from Chitral down to Bajawar, down into Kuram, and eventually he ended up in North Waziristan with the Haqqani group, who were the highest bidders in this case. He was eventually released, thankfully, but I think, to me, this was something that was very clearly indicated, one, the extraordinarily complicated nature of the whole thing, and two, the way in which it's as much of a business for people raising funds and as much of a business as it is a military or political struggle there. And I think Jere's experiences could speak to that as well. That's all I have to say about the Haqqani group. If there's any questions, people can ask afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sure there are a lot of questions out there. Those were fascinating. I'm going to just take the moderator's prerogative for 1 second because I'm dying to ask a couple questions. The first is to Jere, and this is that you mentioned what I think, for me, was the most sort of striking aspect of your first book, this interaction with this Egyptian army major in 1981. Clearly a very radicalized fellow, scared even some of the Haqqani folks that you were with. In retrospect, at the time, in your first book, you didn't really understand what this meant in a lot of ways. In retrospect, reading that today, we see it through very different eyes. And I'm wondering what you think from your second book when we go back and read it in a decade. I realize that's almost an impossible question, but is there something there that you think we're going to see in different light as time passes? And then to Anand, I'm wondering if you could just expand a little bit more on this relationship between the Haqqanis and Mullah Omar and the Quetta Shura, and what do those rifts look like? Because it strikes me that for the future of this sort of coalition effort there, trying to divide those two movements to the degree that is possible is something that we would want to aspire to. So, Jere first.
I know that one of your former colleagues, Brian, up at West Point's Counterterrorism Center, said we're trying to find out whatever came of Rahman, the man who was the Egyptian army major who was with us. And they asked if I knew any more, and I said, no, I don't. I do think that I still believe that there is a tie, and I've heard this even today, based upon other things I've heard over the years, and particularly when the men who had me said there are two groups here. Ultima, yes, in many ways, this is a jungle. Clearly, it's a jungle. And because one of the men who came in on one of my interrogations, who shined a light in my eyes for about a half hour that far away, and he's Teek, and he how are you? I'm Teek, I'm cool. It was Pakistani slang that you would not hear the word Teek in my experience in Afghanistan. And my jailers said there are all kinds of animals in the jungle. And they also said to me that there is a clear hierarchy. Mullah Omar, Batullah Masood, who was then alive, Haqqani, and Wali Khan, who was with us, Shah Saab, who was part of Mohammed Agency. Were those names actual names? Those people really part of the hierarchy? I don't know. And then they would all say, but Al-Qaeda has an international agenda, it has institutional backing, and we have our own very complicated relationships with the Pakistanis, who are like you. They are the men we deal with. They're spin gear, they're graybeards. I think that most of the men, all of the men I saw, all the time, were from the ages of about 18. I saw one Al-Qaeda fellow in Kunar, 18 to one of the oldest man, my jailer was 36. He said, I'm about 36. The Malawi was about in his early 30s. So what do we have to look for in the future? I'd say that their strength, their willingness to continue to fight. The men who had me, yes, wanted money. They also wanted a prisoner exchange, but I think deep down they would not stop fighting if you gave them money. I think they would fight to the death because the oldest of them, the jailer, who had 9 children, would get so worked up when he would talk about being a suicide bomber. I said, what about your children? He said, I don't care about my children when it comes to this. And one of the other Taliban said, I would be happy if my children grew up to be suicide bombers. In other words, that he would teach them. And they tried to convince me, began to try and find ways to make me a suicide bomber of the Pentagon. So I think the radicalization, the commitment right now is so strong, which is one reason why I began this with the 1973, how none of this existed. And the result of this, in my view, the destruction of the soul of Afghanistan over the last 30 years is such that it's going to take a while. In 10 years, Brian, I think this is still going to be going on.
The question of the relationship between Mullah Omar and the Haqqanis, there's a man I know who lives in Kabul named Ghani Mohammed, and he was Sirajuddin's deputy until 2008. And I asked him this question because it's a very difficult thing for me to sort of get my head around. He told me he was once sitting with Siraj over lunch, and the Haqqanis are mujahideen, or at least the older generation were mujahideen, who were disarmed by the Taliban when the Taliban came to power in the mid-90s. So there's a lot of ill will from their part on the Taliban. And so this person that I know asked Siraj, why do you still fight under the banner of the Taliban? Why do you associate yourself with the Taliban? Because they're disrespectful to the mujahideen. And Siraj turned to him and said, who is Sirajuddin Haqqani? And the Ghani Muhammad looked at him and stared and said, what do you mean? And he said, who is Siraj? And this is in 2007. And he says, who is Siraj? Does anybody in the world know who Sirajuddin Haqqani is? And he said, well, I don't think so. He said, nobody knows. Who is Mullah Omar? And Ghani Muhammad said, well, we know who Mullah Omar is. He said, and then Siraj said, Mullah Omar is the most powerful person in the world, which may have been an exaggeration, but that's what Siraj thinks. And he said that the world knows Mullah Omar, and Mullah Omar is seen as a leader of the Islamic resistance of Afghanistan. And as long as that's the case, we have to fight under Mullah Omar's banner. We have to fight with Mullah Omar, which the exchange leads me to believe that the Haqqanis view the Taliban or Mullah Omar as sort of a mark of legitimacy for them, because without that, they would just be regional warlords in the southeast. And but with the approval of the Taliban and the approval of Mullah Omar, in their eyes and in the eyes of the people they're trying to reach, they're representing something larger. They're representing the national movement against the invaders or the infidels. And so I think that you'll never ever see Haqqani say anything openly against Mullah Omar and the Taliban, or ever even admit that they are a separate group. And I've asked Siraj more than once, about the Haqqani network, and are you an independent group? And he'll say, there's no such thing as the Haqqani network. We are all just fighters for the Taliban. In reality, it's much more complicated. They do operate independently. An example of this is when the United Nations was attacked, the United Nations guest house was attacked last year. The Taliban have had an arrangement with the United Nations in Kabul where they won't attack them in return for the United Nations not going into Taliban-held territories. Haqqani basically ignored this agreement and went and sent suicide bombers and attacked a UN guest house. And so they operate very independently, but they at the same time have to maintain the facade of fighting under the Taliban.
Okay, questions? Yeah, right here. Please use the microphone and identify yourself.
William Seymour, International Peace Quest Institute. Just your description of Kabul in the 70s as the Paris of the East, I'm so regretful that I wasn't alive then to see it, and that I may never see that again. It was very spellbinding. But do you think that it will ever be possible in the future to see Kabul as sort of a more, I guess, not a Western city, but more of a modern, peaceful, pleasant place to visit? Or has the character of the people there fundamentally changed to the point where it'll be something completely different entirely? Thank you.
The Kabul I remember of the 70s was 1 story high or 2 stories high. Now there's a lot of construction, there are traffic jams. During the 1980s, when Abdul Haq, one of the main Mujahideen leaders, was operating, he was the principal one of the principal men Mujahideen operating in Kabul, he had a tough time for a long time. Kabul was a safe place. The Soviets were able to provide electricity, they were able to provide heating oil, and life went on in a great many ways. And if you talk to some of these older people, they say it was one of the best times. It's a very hard thing to say in the United States for women in Afghanistan today. I don't know anybody, or very few Westerners. I thought I was one of the very few who would walk around Kabul. It becomes increasingly difficult. I think it's much worse now than it was when the Soviets were there. There's no comparison to what it was in the 1980s. Do I think it's going to be a gentle place? No, not for a very long time. In my view, the soul of Afghanistan has been totally destroyed. One woman I know said the men and the horses have all become crazy. Just her way of explaining this. I would love to see a peaceful Afghanistan, but will the Iranians or the Pakistanis allow that? I think it's going to take a very long time. I hope by the time you're older that it will be. For me, I don't know yet.
Okay. Right up here.
Do we need a mic?
Yes. Hold on one second.
Hello, my name is Ole Nielsen. I'm a journalist from Denmark covering Afghanistan also, and I was also there in the 70s. I wonder, you said in Pakistan you were jailed by Wahhabis.
They told me they were Wahhabis.
Anyway, but your meeting with Taliban in Afghanistan before, could you elaborate on how, what did they tell you, how was that? Because that was certainly another experience.
It was. The first time was near Asadabad in Kunar province. There were about 6 of them. Only one person spoke. He held a rifle right in front of me. My interpreter was shaking. He was so afraid. He said, when I asked him, "Why do you fight?" "We want to be like the Mujahideen. We want to drive the infidels out. We want this country to be a pure Islamic country. We hate Karzai. We hate the Americans." I said, "Where's a better Islamic country?" "Pakistan," he said. I said, "Where do you go for support?" "I go across to Pakistan." I said, "Who helps you?" And that was the first time a Talib said to me, "Men like you, graybeards." Who are these men? And then he hemmed and he hawed and he wouldn't come out and say it. Another time, when I was up in a place called Dukalam on the border, I went across into Chitral and met with a Taliban leader who told me about growing up in a madrasa, told me from there he was taken by men who taught him how to use machine guns, and he was very good at various weapons, small arms that he was given to train with. He also said that, "Who is this Mullah Omar? Gulbuddin Hekmatyar is a man I respect," in Chitral. He also said, and he gave very explicitly, he explained how much they got for stealing a uniform, how much they got for planting an IED, how much more they got if the IED went off, how much they got for killing an American soldier. Ultimately, the most money came from or was given to the family of a suicide bomber. Where did you get this money? Political, religious parties, and from graybeards like you. To continue that, I came back across the border. They wanted to come after us, but the men who had me had agreed to set up an interview with an MI officer, a military intelligence officer, separate from the ISI. And I don't really understand the distinction between the two along the border, but I've been told by different people that MI is more lethal, it's quiet. I can't prove any of that. And we never did meet. Because I had the camera, I was all set to do this, and it becomes very complex, and I deal with that in the book. I'm not going to tell you, so you'll read that in the book. But I became increasingly frightened and paranoid because they had come after me, and even in writing, they threatened me in writing. I have the letter, and twice they threatened me. But each time, the times in Kunar, and then further south in Nangarhar, they all came across the border. They talked about their support in Pakistan, and it became increasingly clear to me that they were not doing this alone. But each time, as frightened as I was, particularly on the time up in south of Kunar when there was a predator overhead and we were using truck flashlights at about 1 in the morning to conduct the interview. How am I going to survive this? But they said, you seem like a nice man. We would like you to convert. Would you care to join? Would you care to become Muslim? And next time we'll take you to our training camps. And many times they said that. What did I say? I said thank you. Thank you. So all of my experiences I felt with them, which were short, was that they clearly had backing, and I was trying to pursue the angle of to what degree of American taxpayer money using to finance Taliban to kill American soldiers, and I was looking for direct Pakistani involvement. But it became clear to me, among the men who had me in prison, it was far more complex than that. Very complex. I went to
Anand, I'm wondering if you have anything to add on this in terms of, because some of the reporting that you've done has, suggested this Pakistani influence to one degree or another, institutional to some degree, influence behind some of these groups. Do you have anything to say on this?
Well, I think everything you said seems to jive with what I've seen as well. I've interviewed Taliban fighters who've detailed how they've gone into Pakistan and met with people, presumably ISI, they don't use the word, but Pakistanis with beards usually, actually. And there was one person in Wardak province that I interviewed who he was a Taliban commander who got into a fight with another commander, sort of a turf war, and he was summoned into Pakistan, into Peshawar, and taken to meet Pakistani, presumably an ISI officer, and he describes the meeting about how the ISI, or the person, listens to both sides and then makes a decision on who's right and who's wrong. And to me that was very surprising to see that they're even micromanaging some aspects of the insurgency.
Interesting. Yeah, up here. For the mic.
This was a fascinating...
Where are you from?
I'm Mitzi Wertheim. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. This was an absolutely fascinating discussion from both of you. I guess my question is, having seen that we now have a change of command on the American side, how do you think this is all going to play out? Is what's coming out of U.S. policy just not making any sense? If you had to make recommendations as to what we ought to be doing based on your experiences and knowledge, what would be your advice?
Okay, I'll go first. I wonder, I think of the editorial in the New York Times last couple of weeks says the U.S. is flying blind in Afghanistan, and this Major General Flynn, the intelligence officer to McChrystal, said a few months ago that complaining about the total lack of intelligence getting from, in this case I assume the CIA, and I don't know if that was a turf war between the military and the civilian intelligence, but a lack of understanding. And just the other day I read something in the Washington Times where a general in the South said we can't understand the Pashtun mind. And I sometimes wonder if McChrystal's statements were somehow, part of them were born out of frustration, the inability to clearly understand what they're doing, their enemy, and how they're going to master this situation. In my conversations with some people at PRTs, I would say, do you know that I have heard so many stories about the mafia that runs your interpreter service here? You have to buy your way into becoming an interpreter. There's a war going on underneath here between the old Mujahideen and the communists, and they're fighting it out now. And the Americans only want someone who doesn't have a beard. And the Americans, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Now, I realize I was only talking to lower grade officers, but there is such a confusion there. And I have to be very humble about this, that I don't have the answers to this, but I certainly believe that if the administration's policy regarding Afghanistan, I'm still uncertain about. I ultimately don't know if we're there to try and ultimately, is it to surround and contain China in a certain way that we contain the Soviet Union? Has to do with oil supplies, have to do with surrounding the Iranians, have to do so many of these other things that are unspoken. Because otherwise, why don't we just go level with the Pakistanis about everything that we are hearing and observing regarding certain elements of the Taliban. I mean, the CIA man I worked with on Charlie Wilson's War still goes and works with former ISI guys. They go to parties together. What is going on? I think there's a lot of things beneath these are things you don't talk about publicly, but I think there are things underneath the table that are really, to me, a bit confusing. What is America's policy?
I'm just as confused as you are. I'm not sure exactly what the U.S. policy is, but there's a saying in Afghanistan that the U.S. has not been there for 9 years, but 1 year 9 times. And this is it goes back to what you're saying about the complete lack of intelligence and understanding of the situation on the ground whatsoever, that you see the same mistakes being made again and again and again in the country. I would like to find out what exactly is the administration's policy before I can actually make recommendations on what they should do instead. But broadly speaking, I think that there needs to be an approach where they come to terms with the Pakistan issue. They come to terms with the fact that I think this war can't be won militarily, and they need to come to the table at some point with the belligerent parties.
Anand, do you think that we can negotiate with the Haqqanis, led by Siraj?
I don't think we can negotiate independently directly with the Haqqanis. I think that it has to be done through Pakistan and the Taliban movement as a whole.
Jennifer, back there.
My name is Howard Rizvi. I did work on same story for like 12 years now. I do share your all that experience, but I've been in the custody of MI instead of Taliban, so it's not that big difference. Talking about Haqqani group and Pakistan involvement, but I'd like to ask about if either of you know about Eastern Shura. We know about Southern Shura a lot, Quetta Shura, whatever. Eastern Shura, if someone heard about it, which is based in Peshawar. It controls whole the southeast and the eastern command of insurgency. And there are 2 shuras rather. One is Hikmatyar Shura, which operates from Shamshatu camps, and other is just Kachagadi here and there. And
Hikmatyar is still very much involved, and that's where a lot of his support.
This is what I'm talking about.
That's true.
And second thing, Gopal, as you mentioned, that Haqqani came into action after 2 years. But as much I know, and I was there in Jalalabad, after Tora Bora, the Shahi Court debacle, very few people talk about it, where the first ever U.S. security force fatality happened. It was Haqqani group already in action. And as I did write in 2005 a whole piece on it, it was about how Haqqani actually built the southern insurgency, sending his Mujahideen, old experienced trainer, because Taliban were completely scattered. And so bring back the life to insurgency. So my question is that when you talk about Haqqani group, there's a lot of, in fact, confusions we can see on the ground, because we saw Shahi Court happening, and then we see these fighters coming back and forth. So my question is, have you understand who these fighters are? Are they born and grown on the Afghanistan side, or they are born and grown in North Waziristan, where actually Sirajuddin Haqqani grown up all his life?
Okay, thank you.
I think you should talk about the Eastern Shura. I haven't had any exposure to Peshawar in 4 or 5 years now. You're far better than I. I'll just say one very small thing about the men that I was with who had captured me. The commander had a Kunar accent. The others had come from Pakistan, what we today call Pakistan in the tribal areas. My 2 bodyguards were Shinwari, and they had come from the Jalalabad region and lived in the Landikoto region now. And they were there because of disputes, land disputes, and this factional war that's going on. Many people, or some people, have told me that one reason I was kidnapped was because I got caught in between this clan warfare, and this was one reason. I'm not sure that this is the case. I've heard many stories. But my experience is that the men of the 3 Taliban groups I was with before I was kidnapped, everybody was from Afghanistan, except those who I met south of Tora Bora, came across. My interpreter told me, because of the accent, which I could not tell or distinguish among, from North Waziristan, which doesn't really apply, but that's what he said. So I think that there's, how many people cross every day, how many thousands, to them the Durhan line in so many ways is irrelevant. I think you should. I'm sorry? I mean, who had me? Who kidnapped me?
As I understand, the group which was holding you might be a group called Jaish-e Salafia now, which is actually extension of Jamilur Rahman group of the old time. It's the only Wahhabi group which is operating in Kunar only.
But I was not in Kunar. I realized Wahhabis are in Kunar, but I was either. They said we were in Damandola. And there are many very specific references to Damandola, which is in Bajur, which I realize is right across from Kunar. You're right, perhaps. I'm sure you know far more than I do about this. Thank you for that. Go ahead.
The Eastern Shura, is also known as the Peshawar Shura, was formerly run by a man named Maulavi Kabir, who has been since arrested by Pakistan. And I believe they're a subordinate shura to the overall Quetta Shura. There's a number of different shuras that are in the Taliban leadership. The Peshawar Shura is responsible for the northeastern provinces like Kunar, Laghman, Nuristan, and Wardak in addition. There's been some analysts who believe that it's sort of an independent center of power. I don't believe that. I think they are subordinate to Quetta. Also about Shahi Kot, I believe that if you're referring to the Operation Anaconda in March of 2003, that the leader of the resistance there against the U.S. Incursion was a man named Saif Rahman Mansour, who is not really a Haqqani fighter. He leads his own, and we're sort of splitting hairs here, but he leads his own network of fighters, and he's from a family like Haqqanis who's been around and fighting jihad in various ways for 20, 30 years. Now, it may be that some of the people fighting under Mr. Mansour could have been former Haqqani fighters and once again became Haqqani fighters, but it was under his banner that they were fighting in March of 2002.
I'm gonna ask Jere a quick question, because you end your book with a little bit of a cliffhanger, right? With 3 voicemails or messages on your answering machine from the Taliban, from your former captors, and you never get to what they say or what that relationship is like. So I thought maybe you'd want to discuss it.
Fair question, Brian. When I was brought through the airport by the FBI in Kennedy, and they took me into a room, and a group of men around me, they said, "You're safe. You're home now. You're safe." And then they said, there are messages from the Taliban on your phone. We advise you not to answer the phone for a few days, but when you do, would you tell us if you recognize any of the accents or you know who these people are? So I got back to my apartment in New York, and I looked at the blinking lights for 3 days, 4 days, and I couldn't take it anymore. And then I listened to the messages, and it's, "Hello, Mr. Jere. How are you?" About 3 men. I did not recognize their voices. They didn't say anything more than that, but in effect is, "We have your phone number. We know where you are. How are you?" I've received about 40 phone calls. My family's been contacted. I do not mention my family's name at all in this book. I have a sister-in-law who is frightened that I've put her children in danger. It's made it very awkward in my own family because of the fear that some young man may become increasingly radicalized by the continuation of the war and along the border with drone attacks. And I've asked the FBI if I'm okay. They said, "You're fine." I'm wary. I think of the threat that Hekmatyar made Was that just an empty threat a long time ago as bravado? It's a factor. I do worry about it. Once my interpreter called and said, "It's your neck," on my cell phone. I don't answer the phone very much. If only if I see if I recognize the number. If it's a 92 area code, Pakistan, I don't answer it.
Okay. Other questions out here? Yes, right here in the second row.
First of all, thank you so much for this incredible presentation. I just had a question in regards to what you were talking about, the future of Afghan safety. And you said that it might be compromised by nations such as Pakistan and Iran. Can you just please further elaborate on what interests Iran might have? Because Madam Shireen Hunter was here 3 days ago, and she was emphasizing on the pride that she has that Iran is one of the rare Muslim nations that has actually never been actively involved in the Afghan insurgency over the past 3 decades. So if you could elaborate on that.
My experience or my knowledge is that I rely upon is anecdotal. I don't really pay too much attention to what I read so much in the newspaper, or that the military will say that for example, that Dadullah has an operation along the Iranian border, and he has arms coming across from the Iranians. The people who had me said that we're negotiating with the Iranians. Or the jailer said to me, not the people. The jailer said to me, we're negotiating with the Iranians via the Pakistanis to get missiles to shoot down helicopters with, and when they come here, the Iranians, the Pakistanis will put the appropriate symbols on there to show that they're not Pakistani. Is that true? I don't know. But I'll tell you something that was very interesting, that in 1984, when I was the guide for the Afghan Mujahideen government in exile in New York, and we put on a reception in the UN Plaza Hotel for the members of the UN to come and meet the government in exile. And Hekmatyar came, and he was in the corner. And what I found most interesting about that period was that when the Iranian mission walked in, they greeted one another like they were the best of friends. And they stood in the corner and hugging and talking with one another. And I said, wait a minute, Hekmatyar is Sunni, Shia, what's going on? But in 1984, there was a tie there. So is there something underground that goes on that we don't know about? I don't know. Yes, perhaps 20% of Afghanistan is Shia, and there's the ties. The Iranians are building a beautiful university in Kabul, and they're spending a lot of money. There's talk that they don't want to fight the Americans in Iran. They're going to fight them in Afghanistan. There's supposedly you hear stories about special forces bases in Baluchistan and along the border. I don't have the ultimate answer there, but I do feel that this ongoing battle over Afghanistan between Pakistan and the Iranians still exists. And I remember when Dan Rather was still around, and he had a long interview with Karzai at the very beginning on the 60 Minutes thing, and I would just happen to be sitting there, and he talked about how Karzai went on and on about what the Iranians and the Pakistanis are doing inside. I have some experience on my own and knowledge on Pakistan. I don't have anything other than what I've just said about Iran.
Anand, do you have anything on this?
Just to add that Iran has, for more than 30 years, supported various groups, particularly during the Russian invasion. The Shia Mujahideen parties were all supported by Iran. The leaders were based in Iran. So I don't think it would be accurate to say that they haven't been involved.
Okay, I think we've got time for one or two more questions up here.
Mitzi Wertheim, the Naval Postgraduate School. Jerry, what are you going to do next with your life? I mean, it's sort of an unfair question, but it sounds to me as if Afghanistan is not something that you can keep dealing with, considering the anxiety.
So many people, thank you for asking. Many people ask me that question, and I don't have an answer. They say, you can never go back there. You cannot go back to Afghanistan. But a part of me is haunted by the fact that I betrayed, in fact, one of my best, the man who I felt so close to, Hajidi Muhammad. I've heard so many stories about how I got out, who was involved in helping me, what happened here, what happened there. I get emails, not just phone calls. there's a part of me that wants to resolve this. There's an old Afghan saying that if you have an enemy, dig two holes, one for him and one for yourself. And I think revenge is a terrible thing, and you have to be. I feel very sorry for Zaif, who's so angry, and I think you have to be. There's a certain amount of catharsis you have to forgive and go on. David Roden and Kristen, his wife, sent me an email last night, and we have this. Obviously, we talk about a lot of things, and he was talking about the catharsis. He was talking about the catharsis to leave it and go on. And I have an editor at Holt who says, you absolutely cannot go to Afghanistan. I want you to focus on something positive, something that's not dark. I don't know yet what I'm going to do. I have to see. I've never met her. I read her book, and I've certainly heard of her. Well, maybe I'll say hello sometime.
Okay, do we have any last questions? Yeah, this will be the final question.
Thank you very much. My name is Todd Sibley from Howard University. You spoke about your intimate knowledge and the history you had in Afghanistan, which I think benefited you obviously in your travels. We have in our intelligence community very young fellows who often haven't even been outside of the country. What recommendations would you make for any of these young kids in order to gain some experience, not in a life-threatening way as you experienced, but what advice would you give for those kids being trained and those who are training them? And thank you very much.
Heavy dose of humility. I noticed that when I came back, when I was in the U.S. Embassy, and the FBI was in control, but various men came in, one man from Defense Intelligence, and he began to ask me questions, and I could see that he had done his research. Then a group of young men came in, wearing sweatsuits. They looked like they were in their 30s. And they didn't ask any questions, and I talked, and I said, is it because they know far more than I do, or they don't know anything at all? I don't know. I'm not going to speculate. My advice, very simply, in the same way that the military in Vietnam, the term of punching a time clock came in. The U.S. military, especially officers working their way up the Pentagon, would go over there for 11 months, and then they come back, and it would help them. They put the appropriate symbols on their appropriate medals, and they move their way up the hierarchy. The same thing is happening among military in Afghanistan today. They go for 6 months, years. They don't know anything, or what they learn is not passed on. Learn the language, understand the culture. I would spend as much time as I could with people, and do not disrespect them. Understand the culture very, very deeply. I had a friend whose father was in the army in World War II and went into up from Africa into Italy, and she showed me a booklet that the U.S. Army gave each soldier before they invaded Italy. And it was an introduction to Italy and how to respect the people, respect the museums, respect the culture. And it was it's like that. That's for the military only. And I've never heard of anything being given like that in Afghanistan. When I was traveling with tribal leaders and people along the border, and a U.S. military convoy comes right down the road, and people in the front are screaming, Haji, Haji, get out of the way. It's just like guys in Vietnam shouting slope and all the other derogatory terms that they get towards the Vietnamese. And that pervades itself. And I think there's a certain arrogance. And my goodness, the fact that the CIA people near Khost were blown up by this person was just, how could they be so naive in so many ways? It's easy for me to say that, and I should be very careful to respect what they're trying to do, but learn the languages. It takes a long time. This is why this gentleman on my right is so affected, because the language, the cultural understanding. The reason I survived, I feel one part reason was that it was an understanding of the culture, respect for the culture, and we would have many conversations about that, and we go back and forth to try and win them over. I think respect is crucial.
Anand, do you have any final thoughts on that?
No, I agree with everything you said.
Okay. All right, well, let's end it there. Thank you very much.